Thank you very much, and good morning to you all. For those of us sitting up here at the front, we are absolutely thrilled that we actually have a standing room only crowd now. I think it's testament to all sorts of things, but not least of which is the leadership role, in effect, the Productive Safety Nets program is having throughout Africa and possibly the world. And I think your presence here is a reflection of that interest. Well, as you all have heard from our speakers already this morning, we are talking about a big program. This is not some small boutique idea of a particular donor. This is a program that reaches approximately 1.3 million people directly in terms of participation. 1.3 million people directly in terms of their participation either in public works over a 6-month period or through the receipt of unconditional transfers either in cash or in kind. If we then take those direct participants and look at the size of their households, overall the program reaches approximately 8 million people. It operates across drought-prone and food-insecure localities in Ethiopia, both in the highlands and in the lowlands. It operates on a budget of more than $400 million a year, and it's operated continuously since 2005. By any stretch of the imagination, this is a big program. And given the size and magnitude of the program and the investment made both by the government of Ethiopia and its development partners, it's the sort of program that we would like to know fundamentally, does this program work? And since 2006, myself, along with my colleague Dr. Alamayu, have led an independent evaluation of the PSNP. This is in itself, and certainly at the time of its inception, was also something unique in Ethiopia and arguably unique across much of sub-Saharan Africa. The idea that you would have a program operating at this scale and that it would be evaluated independent of either the government or the donors. And indeed, a very valuable feature of this program as it's gone forward is its ability to actually draw on these evaluation results. In effect, there is an element of the evaluation which is collaborative, an element which is consultative, but also the evaluation itself remains independent. What do I mean by these things? Well, in terms of the design of the evaluation, what are the types of questions that should be asked, for example? Those types of questions are determined in consultation with the government, particularly with Ato Berhanu and his colleagues, with the donor partners, with important input from CSA, who's also been a very important partner in this evaluation work, as well as the evaluation team. And what that means is that the questions which are being answered are questions which are directly relevant to the program itself. What do I mean also by collaboration? Well, at the point in time in which results are being generated, they do not just sit in a desk in Addis or in London or in Washington, but they're discussed extensively. During the last evaluation round, we held 12 sets of workshops and conferences to discuss results, meeting more than 300 people to discuss these. And what this means is when we talk, for example, about the performance of the program, we're not just talking about it with 1 or 2 people, but we're actually taking these results back to those individuals who are responsible for implementing them. Not only do they get an assessment of their performance along certain metrics, but importantly, they get to see how they stack up against their peers in other parts of the country, seeing where, in fact, they actually perform well, and where there might be places from which they could learn in order to improve their own performance. All of this occurs, though, with a very clear understanding that the evaluation itself is independent. At times, we receive some comments and some suggestions, indications of where we may have misinterpreted the data or the program, but ultimately we, as the evaluators, are responsible for its contents. The scope of the evaluation itself is large, given the size of the program. Since 2006, on a biannual basis, we interview approximately 4,000 households in the highlands of Ethiopia, and since 2000, it's qualitative work in order to have both quantitative and qualitative perspectives. This work itself has also been an opportunity to work with CSA on enhancing their own capacity, and in particular the capacity to undertake longitudinal household survey work, something which had not occurred prior to the implementation of the PSNP. Well, with that background, what do we know about the program and how it works? Well, I think here it's very important to be aware of the context in which this program operates. At the time of its inception, less than 5% of the localities in which it worked had electricity. less than half the localities in which the program worked were accessible by road during the rainy season. Between 2006 and 2012, 85% of the households in these areas experienced at least one drought shock, and at least 50% experienced back-to-back drought shocks. On top of that, as you all know, there were significant rises in food prices in Ethiopia, including in these localities, as there were elsewhere in Africa and around the world. So what would we expect in an environment where there is repeated drought, there is rapid food prices, there is poor infrastructure? Given at times the somewhat tragic history of Ethiopia, our expectation is that there would be widespread food insecurity, worsening hunger, and potentially famine. Instead, what do we see? Well, we see food security improving by 5 percentage points per year between 2006 and 2012. We see asset levels either remaining stable, in the context, for example, of people's livestock holdings. We see things like quality of housing stock doubling between 2006 and 2012. If we look at girls' schooling increases by approximately 50% between 2006 and 2012. And many of these impacts that I'm describing can be directly attributed to the program. Beyond these impacts, the program also contributes to household resilience by both allowing households to stabilize their asset bases, but also by providing a mechanism by which they can make investments which make them more resilient to future drought shocks. Some of these investments are done, as you heard earlier, in the context of the Household Asset Building Program, the HAB. A very good example is that PSNP participants are much more likely, or about 20% more likely, for example, to invest in stone bunding, a mechanism by which one protects soil quality and reduce soil erosion on their farms. But the resilience-enhancing effects of the PSNP go beyond the household. At the community level, there was work done on a variety of areas in terms of environmental protection. These include things like gully reclamation, the development of microbasins for irrigation, tree planting. Matt already mentioned the carbon sequestration benefits of this. Importantly, what these mechanisms do is that they actually allow for better water control, they reduce soil erosion, and at a community level, make these localities more climate resilient than they had been in the past. The final point is that the operations of these programs are run through the government of Ethiopia, as Ato Berhanu described to us in his opening remarks. Well, what do I mean by that? It means that government authorities at the warda, that is the district or county level, and at the sub-district or kabele level, are responsible, for example, for identifying beneficiaries, for having public consultations on these. As you know, in much of Africa, oftentimes we see a democratic deficit in terms of consultation and participation. The PSNP has an appeals mechanism by which those who feel they have been excluded from the program incorrectly can actually appeal that particular outcome. Local authorities are heavily involved in the planning of the program, and they're also the first line of response when a localized drought shock occurs in terms of handling additional caseload that might arise from that. In other words, in the context of this wider conference, the PSNP actually hits on a number of areas simultaneously. It enhances resilience at the household level, it enhances resilience at the community level, and it enhances resilience at the level of governance, of its state capacity. Now from this, one might temptedly say, well, these all sound like very encouraging outcomes. They absolutely are. As I think both particularly Matthew and Ato Berhanu have alluded, at times they've not been easy outcomes to attain, but they are legitimate and important accomplishments of the program. One might be tempted to say, well, perhaps we should start copying this elsewhere in Africa. And one can readily see armies of consultants fanning out across the subcontinent saying, here, look at this particular design. Why don't you try it in my country or this country? I know Ato Berhanu increasingly has calls saying, would you come to our country and describe to us the success of your program? I think these types of calls or these trips being made around Africa may actually be missing the fundamental strengths of the program. The fundamental strengths don't lie in the technical design. It's not that there are 6 months of public works as opposed to 4 or 8. It's not so much necessarily in the planning documents that ward officials provide. The real strengths of the program lie in 3 features. The fact that this is a government, a nationally owned program, which the government takes both pride and ownership in. That, as Matthew described, there is a very high level of donor coordination and donor commitment. And finally, there was a willingness to take a long-term perspective on this. As the program began, as it's developed, this was not a program where the donors, for example, said, we will be in and out in 2 years and we will solve the problems of food security in Ethiopia. There was not only a recognition, but there was a commitment to actually stick with the program for the long term, even at times when it was felt that, in fact, there might be some large problems with the program that required serious attention. The approach was not to ignore those problems, not to shut the program down, but to address them in a frank and open way. And it is these 3 strengths, the national ownership, the donor coordination, the long-term commitment by all parties, which I perceive as being the strengths of the program and which have allowed it to produce these results. Thank you.